Hello, everybody. My name's Hudson Worsley, Chair of MECLA, the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance, and I'm welcoming you to this online event in partnership with Infrastructure New South Wales. If I can start by acknowledging I'm joining you from Gadigal country of the Eora Nation, and MECLA pays our respect to traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today. We're all on Indigenous land wherever you're joining from around Australia. And I'd like to pay respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders joining us today. All right, now this is a fantastic example today of partnership of industry and government working together. As you know, MECLA is all about collaboration. L is leadership, A is alliance. And so MECLA has been working, particularly Anne Austin's group, and you'll be hearing from Anne shortly, working with the team led by Dana Jacobs and her partner in crime, James Logie, inside Infrastructure New South Wales, to understand the state of readiness of the industry to act on decarbonisation and to use low carbon materials. It's a fantastic collaborative initiative using MECLA's network and industry input to shaping a survey that has then been run by New South Wales Government to find out where New South Wales, but also with a lot of national companies, where the state of industry is at. So I'm really excited to be joined by Dana Jacobs, Executive Director of Strategic Planning and Innovation at Infrastructure New South Wales. Her colleague James Logie, Director of Strategic Planning and Innovation, will also be joining us. Hello, you two. Welcome. And then we'll hear from Anne Austin, Executive Director of ESG Strategy, and she'll talk through what her working group has done and what we've learned from the findings of this fantastic research. So, Anne, welcome. Thank you very much for joining. We'll throw to you shortly, and then towards the end, we'll come together for a Q&A. And I'd encourage, as ever, I think we have 325 registrations, no doubt well over 100 in person right now. If questions come to mind, please pop them in the Q&A, and we'll seek to come to those in the Q&A session towards the end. All right, Dana, can I hand over to you? I'll turn off if you share screen and take us through the process and also the decarbonisation policy that's now live. Over to you. Thanks, Dana.
Thanks very much, Hudson, and thanks very much, MECLA, for bringing us together today. James is just sharing the screen and it looks like it's coming up. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dana Jacobs and I'm joined by my colleague, James Logie, and we are delighted to speak to you today about our Decarbonising Infrastructure Delivery Program. While James figures out how to sort out the screen, I will carry on speaking. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we're meeting, and James and I are on the lands of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation as well. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We released the Decarbonising Infrastructure Delivery Policy and the accompanying measurement guidance a year ago, almost to the day, and the policy went live on Friday. So, as Hudson mentioned, it is now mandatory on New South Wales Government projects. The policy adapts PAS 2080 and other international best practice to the New South Wales Government decision-making process, and that means that we're going to be considering the embodied emissions of our infrastructure projects at the key decision points. The policy applies to New South Wales Government infrastructure projects that have capital expenditure of 50 million or more in the building sector and 100 million or more in the other infrastructure sector, so the linear infrastructure like road, rail, and so on. The minimum scope of the policy is upfront carbon emissions, and you can see those shaded in pink on the screen there. That is the materials used for construction, their transport to site, and the actual construction process. But the policy is very clear that where agencies are more mature in their capabilities and have the ability to assess whole life carbon, this should be prioritised. There are 4 principles that underpin the policy and its actions. So if you were to flip through the policy, you'd see that each of the actions is trying to implement at least one of these principles. The first one is to apply the carbon reduction hierarchy. For those of you who are PAS 2080 enthusiasts, you would recognise this as avoid, switch and improve. And it simply recognises that the best way to reduce emissions is to avoid construction, whether that's through non-infrastructure solutions or minimising the scope of what's built. So it's about asking questions like, okay, we have this problem, we need to develop a business case. What are the technology solutions to address it? Are there existing assets that we can augment? And when new assets do need to be built, how can we do so most efficiently? The second principle is around assessing the upfront carbon impact. It's about measurement. And we all know that you cannot manage what you don't measure. And the policy mandates quantifying emissions at 3 key stages across the project lifecycle. And the idea here is that these are the points where we make big decisions relating to projects, and we need to make sure that those decisions are underpinned by good and robust data. The third principle relates to engaging with the market early. We know that the supply chain has some great ideas, and the best projects have been those that have engaged early, invited innovation, and included that innovation in how the project's been shaped up. So what we're trying to do here is asking projects to emulate that behaviour by engaging early. And the fourth and final principle relates to developing a carbon management plan. This is to be a living document that defines roles and responsibilities, and it ultimately governs carbon management activities throughout the project life cycle. The measurement guidance that we've released is the cornerstone to the policy. It helps to provide a robust and consistent way of measuring emissions. As I said, we need this to underpin those decisions that government needs to make. The guidance is structured around 4 questions, which you can see on the screen. The first is what to measure, as in the precise scope of the project. When to measure, this is at which points in the project life cycle align to those key decisions. How to measure, with which inputs, and finally, how to report, so the precise reporting fields. That has been a very quick refresher on the policy and measurement guidance. And as I mentioned before, they were released a year ago. But what have we been doing with ourselves over the past year? And the answer is quite a bit. Our focus has very much been on supporting implementation of the policy and working towards national harmonisation. Together with our colleagues from other jurisdictions, we have worked on the measurement guidance. And so we adapted the New South Wales measurement guidance together with colleagues from states and territories under the Commonwealth's leadership. And we released the national measurement guidance in June 2024. And that was approved by Infrastructure and Transport Ministers. That was a big step forward in national harmonisation in that we now have a nationally consistent way of measuring the embodied emissions in infrastructure. Following that, we've worked with various government agencies to pilot different parts of the policy to really start understanding how it's going to work in practice. And as Hudson mentioned, we've conducted a capability survey. The results of that were released in early November, and I'm going to come and talk about the results of the survey in a second. And last but certainly not least, we've developed a toolkit of resources to support implementation as well as releasing an embodied carbon data book to further improve measurement consistency. And James is going to speak about both of those things in a moment. But turning to the survey, I'd like to take a moment now to just thank MECLA and Anne Austin and the Readiness Working Group in particular for helping shape the survey and for helping promote it with their networks. We received about 400 responses from across the supply chain, with around 100 from government and 300 from industry. And many of you online would have helped us get that high response rate. So thank you very much for taking the time. It's made all the difference to have those insights from you. This survey is a New South Wales survey. We are the New South Wales Government, but we have had responses from right around the country. The chart that you can see on the left at the moment shows you the state breakdown of where respondents are based, or where they work rather. And you can see that the other jurisdictions are actually quite well represented. In fact, 80% of respondents worked in at least one other jurisdiction, and 3/4 in at least another 2 jurisdictions. So that just goes to show why it's so important for us to work on national harmonisation and why we keep hearing about this from members of industry. And we will keep that front of mind. The chart that you can see on the right is showing you the breakdown of respondents by where people work, as in by region. And you can see that 74% of respondents work in both metropolitan and regional areas. And this was quite an interesting part of the survey for me, because it just went to show that the survey results were not metropolitan specific, but applied across regional areas also. Turning to the actual survey results, for me, this is the most striking chart from the survey. It's showing you the percentage of respondents who are confident in their capability to reduce upfront carbon. And what's striking about it is that when you look to the left, you can see that the professions that have the greatest influence over carbon outcomes have the lowest confidence in their own ability. And if you have a look, that's construction managers, architects and engineers, and business case developers, where fewer than 50% of them are confident that they would know what to do on their project to decarbonise. So it just goes to show that we do have our work cut out for us when it comes to capability. In contrast, if you look at the far right of the chart, the materials sector is saying that they're ready to deliver decarbonised outcomes, which is quite exciting to see. In the survey, we also asked industry to rank the biggest barriers to decarbonisation. And you can see the top three here. The first one up there is cost. Cost is always going to be important, and I'm not surprised this one bar of this chart could have its own webinar, or perhaps series of webinars rather. So it is important that we do spend some time thinking about this as government and industry, but there are two things I'd like to flag here. The first is that our policy has a very big focus on early stage interventions. It's not just about material substitution. We're really looking to agencies to apply the carbon reduction hierarchy, starting with avoiding emissions. And this would come hand in hand with cost savings. Having said that, there is a role for supporting demand for green materials, as we know this drives their premium down. And this is partly going to come from policies like ours, where we ask agencies to consider their carbon impacts and make choices that are informed by carbon quantification. But it's also going to come from other sources of support, which we've seen from other parts of government and industry, like research, piloting, and grants. The second bar on the chart talks about lack of demand from government clients being a barrier to decarbonisation. And I'd really hope that as we see the policy come into effect and capability improve, that this bar will go down. But I guess we'll see in future surveys. And the third one is another perennial one, standards and specifications. We know this is an issue in parts of the sector, and colleagues from across New South Wales Government have been working on this issue, as has MECLA, and it just goes to show that this work needs to continue. So overall on this chart, I'm putting the challenge out there for MECLA and others in industry to really come join forces with government to address the barriers. Having said all that, I want to leave you with a hopeful note. And that's that many of you are already reducing your emissions on your projects and showing us all that it is feasible. If you have a look at the top bar, the blue one in particular, you can see that well over a third of industry respondents are considering the upfront carbon impacts within the projects that they're doing. And if you look at the two bars right at the bottom, the red and the blue, you can see that a fifth of government projects and a quarter of industry projects that industry respondents have worked on have set targets and achieved these over the past 5 years. On that encouraging note, I'm going to hand over to James to speak about the toolkit.
Thank you, Dana, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little about the Decarbonising Infrastructure Toolkit that we've developed, and also a little on the next steps for Infrastructure New South Wales in the decarbonisation space. So the toolkit has been developed very much taking on the findings that we found in the capability survey late last year that Dana has just spoken about. So at a high level overview, the toolkit includes fact sheets, info packs, templates and worked examples. That's for a carbon management plan and a carbon reporting template. an embodied carbon data book and an accompanying guidance note, and case studies. I'll give a brief overview of each of these resources. You can also find them on the Infrastructure New South Wales webpage under Decarbonising Infrastructure, so please go and have a look yourself. We'll also try and post a link in the chat thread. So first of all, starting on the fact sheets, the aim here is to really simplify the key information and concepts within the policy and measurement guidance. Many of you who have joined here today won't need the high-level overview that these contain, but they can be really useful to communicate the quite complex and in-depth information to others within your project teams and organisations. And you can see the three here shown on the slide. The first one is the policy at a glance, which is really a two-page concise summary of the policy. Understanding whole life carbon and infrastructure, setting out the key terms and definitions you need to understand, from upfront carbon to embodied carbon, operational carbon, and also things like enabled or user carbon. And finally, how to reduce carbon on your project. So this fact sheet sets out practical solutions to reduce carbon using the avoid switch improve carbon reduction hierarchy aligned with PAS 2080. Next, on to the info packs. So these are really providing targeted implementation guidance at each stage of the infrastructure lifecycle. And the example shown here on the slide is the stage 1 info pack. So each pack does provide a high-level introduction to the policy, but then steps out a checklist of mandatory and optional actions that specifically apply to that stage, and then also roles and responsibilities by discipline and each value chain member. So that's contractors, designers, and government agency. They're about a 4 to 5 page summary, so certainly a lot more concise than the policy guidance document itself, which is around 50 pages in length. Next is the templates that are really aimed at supporting documentation and reporting of carbon emissions. So there's a carbon management plan template specific to each stage, and that's really taking into account the quite specific steps and actions that you need to undertake at each stage in the infrastructure lifecycle. The Excel reporting workbook has a tab for each stage of the infrastructure lifecycle as well, and that's accounting for the increasing level of detail that you're required to report as you move from business case to design and then delivery. Another thing we heard from the capability survey was that industry wanted to see worked examples really showing how the policy could be applied in practice. So we're going to develop these for each stage across these templates, and have already launched the first one for stage 1 or business case stage. Next is the Embodied Carbon Data Book, and this is one that we're really excited to release and talk about today. And so the Embodied Carbon Data Book aims to enable easier and more consistent measurement across projects by providing more clear guidance pointing to specific default emission factors, carbon intensity benchmarks, and calculation assumptions. You can see here on this slide a range of underlying data sets referred to that the ECD points to. So AusLCI, some of the RICS whole life carbon assessment second edition assumptions. We've also been working extensively with neighbours and Transport for New South Wales to align where we can on the common emission factor data and assumptions. And this will really help to get alignment and consistency in measurement across buildings and other infrastructure projects. We've also gone through an exercise of trying to align as best we can on the reporting outputs between the neighbours embodied carbon calculator and the NSW carbon reporting templates. And the ECD has an accompanying guidance note on selecting carbon tools and data sources. Many of you will be familiar with the Transport for New South Wales carbon tools that will continue to be used on Transport for New South Wales projects. Neighbours is soon to release the Embodied Carbon Calculator that will predominantly be used on building type assets, so think social infrastructure, other government buildings. Where the Embodied Carbon Data Book will be particularly helpful is for other types of infrastructure or mixed projects where one tool doesn't quite meet your needs. Also in the very early stages of projects where data is hard to come by and the carbon intensity benchmarks can be helpful to get those early initial measurement estimates undertaken. Finally, the last part of the toolkit, we've developed case studies sharing lessons from projects that are already demonstrating really good practice in terms of decarbonisation. We also heard from industry respondents that case studies were particularly helpful in upskilling around decarbonisation. So the first three that we've released are a case study on using structural timber to reduce carbon. That's on the New Sydney Fish Market project. You can see in the picture here, the timber is used in the roof and awning structure. The next one is reusing and repurposing assets. So these are the wharf and pier buildings and structures from Walsh Bay. Another fun fact is something like 120 old lamps were refurbished and fitted with LED lights on this project, which is quite a good outcome. And the last one, Sydney Metro City and Southwest. This was a really good example of embedding carbon reduction into procurement with clear objectives, targets and requirements thought about very early prior to tender. So finally, moving on to some next steps to wrap up on the NSW part of the presentation. One of our highest priorities for this year is to commence scoping the expansion of the policy and measurement guidance to address whole of life carbon. We've heard a lot from stakeholders within government and also industry that this is an important next step and important to consider the whole scope of carbon in infrastructure decision making. We've also just starting a project with the Commonwealth Government looking to adapt the Embodied Carbon Data Book for a national version that can be applied by other jurisdictions. And then the last 2 points there really talk to ongoing engagement with other jurisdictions, industry bodies, professional associations on policy harmonisation for decarbonising infrastructure, and one particular effort will be capability uplift, following on from this initial survey and toolkit we've developed. So that's all from NSW this afternoon, but there will be an opportunity to answer questions at the end, so please continue to post them in the thread. I'll hand over to Anne Austin now to talk a little bit about the MECLA Readiness Working Group insights from the survey and some broader next steps for industry.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Dena. Share screens. Let me know if that's not working for any reason. Okay, so my name's Anne Austin. I'm coming to you today from Camaragal land. That's one definer for me at the moment, and the other is that I'm also coming to you as the chair of Working Group 1. Working Group 1 within the MECLA community is looking at how we might increase demand for low and no embodied carbon, because it's pretty obvious if we don't ask for it, we don't get it. So we've been working hard on that, and we'd come across lots of questions from various government agencies in particular about how ready the industry was to respond to a demand should they increase their demand. And that was what started us thinking about the need for some sort of readiness index that would demonstrate are we ready? Are there particular parts of the industry that are more ready than others? Where should attention be spent to try and improve that? And also, how do we build confidence amongst those that are in the powerful position of asking for low and no embodied carbon outcomes to be confident to do that asking? So we like to think of this as, you know, we were the two little ants carrying the same leaf here, because the MECLA team within my working group were asking this deep question about, are we ready? And meanwhile, Dena and her team were also asking the question of, do we have the skills? And we actually came to Dena with this idea of we could do some sort of readiness index, and Dena was like, hey, we need to do some sort of survey as well. And so we've partnered with that. I just want to shout out thanks to all the MECLA people who've been involved in supporting Infrastructure New South Wales on this journey along the way. There's plenty in my Readiness Index subgroup. There are others in the working group generally who've helped with bits and pieces. And there's some from other working groups who also trawled through early drafts of the questionnaire and helped adapt the language to be suitable for industry. And then there's hundreds of you, I'm sure, who actually answered the survey as well. So I think this is a really good example of all of us pulling our weight. Today, I had thought particularly to focus on one part of the survey that we found very interesting, possibly because there's so many people within the MECLA community who are materials suppliers. But there was some really interesting data that came out about material suppliers and producers, which I'm going to walk you through. That's not to say there weren't other interesting pieces of data. There was some interesting data in relation to metropolitan versus regional. We learnt that if you only operated in a regional context, you may have less confidence. But if you operated in both the metropolitan and regional context, in fact, you were more confident with your ability to reduce embodied carbon than those who were just in metropolitan areas. And we had plenty of examples coming in from regions of targets being set and met, which was very interesting for us because we had expected that the regions would perhaps be a little less progressed. But we've chosen today to deep dive rather into just this one area about materials suppliers and producers. I have summarised it as ready and waiting. The number 19 is because there were 19 participants who identified themselves in the survey as being materials suppliers and producers. And I think it's really important to be clear about the sort of scale of the answers that we're getting. So out of 419 is, you know, a fairly small representation. So it's possible that if we broadened the number of suppliers who answered the survey, we may get different results, and certainly broadening it in future is what we want to do. But those 19 had some really interesting things to say. So where are they ready? So of the people who answered the survey, a number of them had very strong indicators that they were very much ready for an ask around embodied carbon reduction. 79% of them said that they had extensive or a good level of knowledge in this space. And you would have noticed on some of Dena's slides that actually it's this cohort that said they have the highest level of confidence in their own personal capability to reduce embodied carbon, which was an unexpected statistic. We expected the sustainability professionals in the room to say that they had confidence in themselves and their capability around embodied carbon, but it was really interesting to see the supply chain coming out and saying, actually, we understand this deeply. We also saw that they're doing things to be ready. Almost 80% of them said that they were always or often investing in R&D specific to embodied carbon reduction. So that's a very high statistic. You know, 4 out of 5 of each of those suppliers are actually putting money behind how might they reduce carbon. They always, again, the always often, 74% of them said that they have actions to reduce embodied carbon, and 67% of them are always or often measuring their embodied carbon. So that's certainly not a minority. We've seen that sort of tipping point, certainly amongst these suppliers who answered the survey. And then what have they got that will actually help us get across the line? Well, 76% of them had products that had EPDs, so environmental product declarations, already in place. We hear often that EPDs are quite complicated to establish, and that if you've never done them before, there's a certain amount of time and cost involved in them. But it was interesting to us to see that the vast majority of the products were already coming with EPDs, and a number of them, more than half of them, had low embodied carbon options. So if somebody said, excuse me, can I have low embodied carbon with that? 62% of the time, the answer would have been yes. And there were 74% who were looking to increase the number of low embodied carbon options that they had available to them within this year, because the survey was last year. So we thought they were pretty strong signs that this cohort felt quite ready to, at least to some degree, reduce embodied carbon from their particular part that they play in the whole embodied carbon journey of a building. However, they did say that they were waiting for that ask. So we see quite different figures when you start to look at what kind of demand were these suppliers experiencing. And so only 37% of them said that they always or often received requests for understanding of the embodied carbon footprint of their product. And 30% of the revenue is the sort of average coming through of the share that comes from the low embodied carbon products. So there's still the minority of the products that are being sold, but that's still a third. So a third of these companies, almost, revenue is coming from embodied carbon products. So we've started, but there's still a long way to go in terms of always being asked for what's the footprint of your product. So at least what's the measurement of it, and then actually making a big difference to those organisations' business models. Now, I did want to just, throw a nod to the avoid, switch, improve kind of hierarchy that we've been hearing, and position this survey and that particular focus on the materials suppliers. Obviously, the lowest cost and fastest way to reduce embodied carbon is not to build, to stick with what we've got, or to then, at least as you move up, retain the structure, or then at least to look at low embodied carbon design. And the MECLA community's been doing quite a lot of work to share how you might do that. And we've had some terrific spotlights on these sort of three parts of it. But there is a huge role to still play for making sure that the materials that we use, because other than this bottom one, we're still using materials even when we retain a structure, and even when we've got low embodied carbon design, we're still using materials. So it's very important that we don't take our eye off the game of having low embodied carbon materials, noting that all of these four things need to be leveraged if we are really going to make some progress in reducing the amount of emissions that come from the embodied carbon side of buildings. So the MECLA's been supporting that whole journey on a number of fronts. If there's anybody on the call who's not familiar with MECLA, we thought it might just be useful to touch on this. So we've got circa 10 different working groups that all focus on various aspects of the system that creates where we find ourselves today in terms of the high levels of embodied carbon coming from the building sector. We've got working groups that are looking at raising awareness, gathering case studies, publishing, information that supports others. We're sharing and building knowledge constantly. There's spotlights and briefing sessions like this, and a huge amount of information on the MECLA website. In that website, you'll find a number of guidance documents. They're everything from guiding people on how to specify low embodied carbon cement and aluminium, through to guidance on where do you start or how might you set a target around embodied carbon reduction. We've been gathering their case studies, and most importantly, we've been building partnerships. Partnerships like the one that you're seeing today between Infrastructure New South Wales and MECLA, but also partnerships within MECLA. MECLA is made up of people from all walks of life. We have builders, designers, engineers, consultants, clients who are government clients and non-government clients, are all holding hands to see how we might tackle this very important problem of embodied carbon. So what do we want to do with that information? So we've thought that that was a really good snapshot. You know, today 400's not bad for your first round of survey, but we would like to do it again. Our vision is that there is a readiness index that happens every, say, 2 years, 18 months to 2 years, to see whether or not we're shifting, and to constantly keep people focused on the fact that the demand side of this story is really important, and that they should be confident in that demand. So we would like to be able to track and communicate industry readiness to help target initiatives and to continue to grow that demand. Ideally, we would like to, in future rounds of the survey, reach more to tier 2 and 3 players and more material suppliers. So a number of the respondents who were in the building game were in the larger scale businesses, and not all of them. There were there was a little bit of a mix, but we think we could go deeper with that. And we'd also like to have a broader group of materials suppliers to see if there's any difference in the readiness, and to be aware of where initiatives may need to be focused across the different scales of business. Now, to do that, we need to have some support financially to be able to run the survey on a regular basis. So if anybody's listening is keen to have their brand attached to the Readiness Index, we'd love to talk to you afterwards to sponsor it. It's not a huge requirement, but we think it could be hugely impactful and something that we could then publish on a regular basis, much like the Climate Index is published by the Australian Government, where they every year they test sentiment on climate. This would be the same sort of idea, that, you know, every 1 or 2 years we test sentiment on readiness around reducing embodied carbon until it becomes something that we all feel we're on top of. So my other ask is that we're calling all project sponsors, developers, contractors and tenants out there to have a little Oprah moment. You know, you get in life what you have the courage to ask for. What's really important in all of this is that we continue to ask for low embodied carbon. You can see from some of the data that we're showing that a large part of the industry is ready and quite confident in being able to meet that ask, but perhaps not being asked enough. And so what does that mean? How do you ask for embodied carbon? It's not a given that everybody understands that. So we had some ideas that we thought we'd share: the when, what, how, and who of asking. Let me take you through those. This is my last slide, and then we'll open up for questions. So in terms of asking for embodied carbon, when is really critical. One of the things that we've learned over the time is that if you're trying to build in a new way or provide products that are different, it takes more time than the traditional tender. And if we leave, say, the materials suppliers until the very last of that whole tender cycle, rather than bringing them in early, they even have less time to respond to a request for something different. There's a very good story that the Lend-Lease Group had experienced, where they had 3 different residential towers that were in the one project, and they had an identical facade, and it took them till the 3rd tower until they were able to crack reducing the embodied carbon of that facade. And that was simply a matter of time to explore different alternatives, to look at what other people had done, to establish new contacts, etc. So if embodied carbon reduction is important for us, we need to look at engaging our supply chain and our designers early and often along the journey. So it's not just once, like it could, you know, continually throughout the cycle, but also ideally outside the project cycle. So if you're in a position to be one of those entities that could ask for low and no embodied carbon, you don't need to wait until you've got a project to do that. You could be talking to your regular supply chain outside of a project about the fact that you are keen to see some innovation in this space, or to learn, or to see what's possible. And then that would be a really clever way of asking for low embodied outcomes, which would more likely to have a better result. In terms of what to ask for itself, we really encourage the invitation for innovation and ideas, and that can be quite challenging sometimes for people who are in, say, a government role where they're trying to compare apples with apples and try and lock everything down and have one sort of specification and don't want anybody to vary from it so that it's comparable. But that old way of tendering is broken if we are going to try and really rethink the embodied carbon story. And we need to find a way to say, here's what we thought we want you to help us with, but please can invite innovation and different ideas in case there's an entirely different design concept or an entirely different material that could be tabled if there was enough flexibility for that to be the case. We strongly recommend requesting an outcome for very similar reasons versus a specific pathway, because there are many ways to skin a cat. And if you're very regimented about a particular, say, product within the building having a low embodied carbon outcome rather than the building as a whole, you may be missing opportunities, or at worst having perverse outcomes that were unintentional. Rating tool benchmarks can help to be specific, but if you're going to suggest that they're used, so if you suggest using things like Green Star, being clear that you want to have the level of rating or the credits specific to embodied carbon, because those tools have a number of different credits that are not necessarily related to embodied carbon. So for example, you could be targeting a 4-star Green Star and not necessarily be leaning into embodied carbon reduction in a way that you thought it might be. And obviously the neighbours tool coming soon is a great way to be simplifying an ask. And then we thought also it could be useful to incentivize targets. So that's another way of asking for it, is to actually say, if there can be a certain reduction achieved, that there may be some sort of reward for that. How, both in the written and verbal brief, conversation trumps specification, rather than just leaving something buried in the writing. If it's really important, you would talk about it, and it sends a very strong signal to people who are responding to tenders and those sorts of project requests if there's a conversation about that. So we really encourage you to talk about it. We encourage you to give weighting to low embodied carbon in those tender evaluations. Make it real. Make it actually count for something. Then this is probably one that might scare some people, but sharing the risk and being open to trials and pilots is really critical, particularly if we're looking at using different types of materials and different methodologies, of being brave enough to actually, well, let's test something somewhere and let's partner on that and go in together. And it really works well if your request for embodied carbon reduction is connected to the overall plan or policy. So in the case of Infrastructure New South Wales, they've put out a policy that touches New South Wales agencies, but for other states or other clients that are on the line here, you might be non-government clients. If you've got your own targets and your own ambitions, tying all that together makes the why quite clear. And then who do you ask? Well, all the players in the value chain for low embodied outcomes. So the project managers, the developers, the designers, the builders, the suppliers, all of them. And if you can, send in your boss to ask. They're much more inclined to listen, and listen strongly. So I think we're now up to question time, and I'll hand back to Hudson to navigate that.
Thank you very much, Anne, and a big shout out to Oprah. Thank you, Oprah, for supporting MECLA. That's great. But I know you're making light of that, but you get what you ask for. And with my consulting hat on, I've been in projects where it was assumed, well, it's regional, so there's no point asking. And because a couple of the suppliers had international or national parts to their organization, they had access to the information. And by asking the player who didn't have an EPD for the required product, suddenly realized, my competitors have got them, I'd better get on with it. And so if you ask, you keep the momentum moving. So that's a really great takeaway. You guys have been really profuse in responding to the online questions. So Dena and James, thank you very much for that. But can I ask, Dena, one of the first things you mentioned was PAS 2080. Alignment to international, national and state. Can you just talk us through how you've had reference to international, because we're in a global market, notwithstanding current shockwaves going through international trade, but it is an international world we're in. Then we've got the national, now we've got this, and your focus is clearly the state. How have you managed that cascading hierarchy of jurisdictions?
I might give this one to James, but I might just defend the states a little before I hand it over to James and say infrastructure's ours. It's not the Commonwealth. So,
yeah,
you know, the power sits with the states, and that's why national harmonisation is such a big deal, because each state has the power to make decisions as to their own infrastructure settings. But with that.
Yeah, thanks, Hudson. I think there was a good question from Geraldine in the chat thread on this.
That's right, yeah.
So I think to start off with, we certainly from the early days of developing the policy and measurement guidance did aim to align with PAS 2080 very closely, which is the leading international best practice standard for carbon management practices, which aligns also with the underlying European life cycle assessment standards, which are used for the measurement and reporting elements. Through the national version of the Embodied Carbon Measurement Guidance released last year, we've also managed to achieve national consistency in adopting that framework for measurement and reporting. And there was also an Infrastructure Net Zero report released just a couple of weeks ago, which goes into a good policy context summary and shows that other jurisdictions are already adopting that national guidance. So it's up to each of the jurisdictions to sort of form their own policy, as we have done in New South Wales. So some examples are Department of Infrastructure and Transport in South Australia with their sustainability manual, and Infrastructure WA have recently released some guidance associated with their strategic asset management framework. So yeah, it's all heading in the right direction, in line with international best practice, and getting that consistency.
Fantastic. That's very reassuring, because many of our members have worked for national or even international organisations, and having worked myself in a national role in the past, having a different rule on each side of a state boundary was frustrating. So it makes perfect sense that this is aligned. So from a MECLA perspective, please, let's keep that up. But both you and our colleagues from Infrastructure New South Wales mentioned the avoid, switch, improve, or the hierarchy. But we're an industry that likes to build things, and governments like to build things. How do we avoid? What does no build look like in the real world?
No build can be actually quite challenging, because some of the things that we have in place do need to change. There's a whole bunch of buildings that don't have easy access for anybody in a disability or with a pram or anything sort of basic like that. Some of them are very mouldy and unsafe and unhealthy. So it's not always possible to retain a building, but even if you can retain the structure, the structure and the substructure, account for almost 2/3 of the embodied carbon in a given building, particularly in a high-rise kind of context. So those things, if we can just keep that alone, that goes a huge way to reducing the embodied carbon. But I think it does start to make us really think about, when is it appropriate to build? In what circumstances is it okay to start afresh? And it's very hard, even with a new building that is going to run more efficiently and have therefore a lot less operational carbon. I have seen some very interesting models that show that it is almost impossible for that new building to be as low in its carbon contribution than a refurbished old building. And we need to start thinking about old as sexy, and which I'm not, I think that's a good idea, as I consider myself old now, so I don't mind that as a concept. So I just think it's challenging us to we'd always put a premium on new and on something that was fresh, and we have to start now questioning where should the premium go. Like a really well refurbished building is going to have a better carbon outcome if we can make it fully electric and actually attend to some of the thermal properties in how we refurbish it over an existing one. But it's a very difficult question for a development company to lean into, for example, because their whole business model is built on building. So they're having to like really rethink it. Can their business model be built on refurbishing, tweaking, adjusting?
Dana, what's your take on that? Because Anne's particularly referring to buildings there. Yours is an infrastructure remit, but how would you respond?
We also care about buildings in that I guess we've got hospitals and schools. So yes. Anne's comments are very, very relevant to us in that regard as well. And Walsh Bay, which James flashed up in the case studies, is a really good example of refurbishment. In the infrastructure sector, it's a combo of things. It's a combination of making sure that we are maintaining things and upgrading them where we can, but it's also a matter of better asset management, better maintaining assets, making sure that they're being, used to their full capacity and not letting things slip. So, and this sort of goes to one of the questions that came up in the Q&A, which I clicked answer live thinking it would put it onto some list, but it didn't. So I apologize to that anonymous person who posted that question, would like to pick it up now, which is around the fiscal context for all of this. To date, we've had a lot of asset recycling money sloshing around in New South Wales, and we've had this huge infrastructure pipeline, and we've delivered a lot of big infrastructure in the state. But that money isn't coming through anymore. That's done, and it's been the case for about a year or two now. And so we need to be turning our minds to how to better maintain our assets, get more out of what we have. And while that might at face value seem like a bad context for this, where people are concerned about the cost of decarbonisation, actually, I think it's a great context for this because it means people really need to turn their minds to how can I make better use of what I have rather than assuming I can build a new shiny thing every single time.
Okay. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Can I ask a definitional question? There's a bit in the chat about upfront versus whole of life carbon, but also looking more broadly to circularity rather than just the carbon side of things. One of the points that is frequently reminded to MECLA is to avoid being in a carbon tunnel or avoid carbon blinkers. How has the Infrastructure New South Wales managed the need for breadth of thinking, but as well as targeted solutions? Maybe James? It's a nice curly one, but
that was a double-pronged question there, Hudson.
It is.
First of all, there's certainly a lot of potential confusion around upfront versus embodied carbon. A lot of people think about embodied carbon as only the upfront construction impact, but it actually, there are varying definitions, does also include sort of the legacy of replacements, refurbishment, maintenance of infrastructure elements, also the end of life disposal or treatment of asset elements. So we have put quite a firm position and definition around embodied carbon versus upfront carbon, and that is why we created that fact sheet on understanding all the parts of whole life carbon in infrastructure. You'll also notice that very similar or the same definitions have been included in the recent Infrastructure Net Zero report. They're also in the IDM version of the Embodied Carbon Measurement, the infrastructure guidance. So one of our goals is to try and get everyone using the same terminology and definitions. And I think that's definitely like a starting block to, set the same goals to work towards. On the comment around circularity, we certainly acknowledge that that's an important piece of the puzzle, and there's also a range of other broader sustainability environmental objectives to think about in decision making. I think it's really hard to expect that you'll have a single indicator or perfect answer in every case on a project. So we even have guidance around saying, well, if you can't quantify whole life carbon, you may need to do a more qualitative assessment. And I think that also comes into play when you're trying to balance circularity, carbon, water efficiency, biodiversity, and all the other things we need to think about in projects. If you have a look at the fact sheet on how to reduce carbon in infrastructure, I think about a third of those solutions would actually have circular economy benefits as well. So I guess where we see the most benefit is if you have something that improves circularity and carbon, that's a sort of a win-win. That's probably an easier decision to make.
Right.
And yeah, we're also working with others in government from Department of Climate Change around broader waste and circular economy policy. So expect more sort of bringing together of the two in the future.
Great. Okay. I was kind of hoping that's where we were going, and delighted to hear that that's the case. And changing tack, can I ask you, you alluded to risk sharing as a way of managing the transition to low emission materials. Could you flesh that out with an example of, what do you mean? What does that look like?
There's a couple of things that come into mind. I saw that question in Q&A from Emily. Any form of early contractor engagement. There are a number of, often large scale projects that will have a master plan or a concept, and then they bring their partners in early in the piece and work together before they then go out to tender. So those kind of early contractor engagement pieces are a great opportunity to flesh out alternatives, look at different designs. Even just to have, even if you've not in that early contractor engagement, if you're in a tender process, to actually specifically say, do you have any improvements that you could suggest or recommend for us to reduce the embodied carbon of this project? That in and of itself as a request would actually, it's an optional, right? So a tenderer can choose not to answer that, but if there is something then that invites an alternative, a non-conforming approach, then they're more likely to get it. Most contractors won't waste time on non-conforming tenders if they don't think they're going to be taken seriously, because it takes an enormous amount of effort. So to actually open that door is useful. And then I'm interested in the whole, this is, I don't know examples of this. There possibly are out in there. I mean, I'm not across every sort of tender that's ever happened. But in terms of risk sharing and piloting something together, let's say you're in the business of tendering roads or something that you know is going to use a lot of a particular material, and there's a suggestion that there's an alternate form of cement or mix or whatever that could be used, and you're not confident about whether or not that's appropriate, well, then perhaps you can, outside the cycle of a project, with some suppliers, fund some sort of trial, test something, see whether it works. What would it take for you to be confident to have that included in your project, rather than just to dismiss it and say, we don't know, therefore we're not going to use it. So actually, leaning into that whole kind of idea of, maybe there's a grant in that, maybe ARENA or CEFC or somebody would help finance some sort of experiment. If it was then going to have this ripple effect, that product could be used again and again and again over, say, in that example, hundreds of kilometres of road. Look, there might be other people on the call who've got other ideas for Emily, who have been on the end of having the door shut on innovation.
And yeah, thank you. There's a lot in that. Unfortunately, we're coming to time. So I'd like to ask each of you just one more question, and that is, what are you expecting to see next? If I can maybe go to you, Anne, briefly, and then finish with James and Denna. You mentioned, Anne, we'd like to keep this going and in 2 years roll it out nationally. What's your hunch? Do you think are we going to see a plateau here, or are we going to see exponential change? What are you expecting?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think sometimes the more you start to learn about embodied carbon, the more you realise you've got things to learn. And we have talked about together that we wouldn't be at all surprised if we did this survey again and we actually found that some people, some parts of the industry felt less confident, only because they were actually starting to understand this more.
Right.
But I think that let's wait and see with that. I think we're well and truly turned the corner on, is this a topic? You know, if we were, 3-4 years ago, it wouldn't have even been a point of conversation. It's now definitely in people's sights. They understand that it's something that they need to lean into. So I expect to see this become less of a tier 1 conversation and more of an industry-wide conversation over time. And I would really encourage, if there are smaller scale players on the call, don't wait till this train runs you over. Get in the carriage now and understand it and see where you can be part of it, because it won't be long before we're being given specific targets, particularly as that neighbours tool comes out, and it takes a bit of time to get your head around it. And I also expect to see my inbox full with offers of sponsoring the next Readiness Index survey.
Excellent. Good plug there. Good plug there. I think Oprah would probably suggest that if you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, just be careful. It's not the train coming to bowl you over. Jenna and James, how do you see things going? Clearly, New South Wales is in a leadership position among fellow collaborative states, but the national alignment is so important. What do you see coming next?
2 things. One, we are starting to see more momentum around national harmonisation. We're having a lot of really productive conversations with our colleagues. And as James mentioned, there's other jurisdictions who are making moves towards policies as well. So I would hope that in 2-3 years' time, we will see more of that national policy harmonisation. But fingers crossed, we will watch the space. And the other thing that, I don't know if this is a hope or if this is what I really think will happen, but it's perhaps a call to action. We need a culture change around this. As Anne said, this is a problem that everyone needs to be thinking about, the whole supply chain. We need to shift this where it's not just sustainability people listening to this and doing something. We need everyone to see this as their business.
I don't think I have much more to add to that, Hudson. I'm definitely excited to see what comes from future sort of national harmonisation efforts and getting sort of a very consistent policy measurement and reporting approach, maybe in the future collecting sort of some data centrally and developing benchmarks. And I think all of that is quite complex, and at the same time we also need to make sure we're engaging with industry and making sure everything is practical and implementable. That's why engagements like this are very helpful. Also, some of the other bits through the Infrastructure Net Zero initiative. So if anyone has any feedback, please reach out, let us know. I think we got to most of the questions. We'll make sure to follow up with the others after the session.
Terrific. All right. Well, Dana Jacobs, James Logie, Anne Austin, and I'd also thank you very much for taking so much time, and also your subgroup. I know there's, you're the spokesperson and also led that group, but boy, there was a lot of work going on behind the scenes. I'm really chuffed to see the fruits of this collaboration. I think it's very exciting, and as you say, momentum building as tier 2, tier 3s, and local government get involved in this. I think we'll start to see more and have more questions. Also, I'd like to thank Alexi and Kati from Climate Kick, part of the MECLA Secretariat that make these things happen. From a MECLA point of view, this is collaboration. This is what the do tank looks like when people get on and get working together. It's fantastic to see. Our next events will be a briefing from ASBEC on their work around policy and recommendations, the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council. And we'll also have a briefing from neighbours about the Embodied Carbon tool and the progress they've made. So keep an eye out on our socials, on our website and the newsletter. And this recording will be put up on the website pretty soon. But to our 3 speakers, thank you very much. To the attendees, thank you for your time. This is the Do Tank. Let's keep doing. Thank you very much, everybody. I look forward to seeing you for an MECLA event sometime very soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.